Hey everyone, how's it going? I recently played every single zombies map in Call of Duty World War II for the first time and made a video documenting the whole experience. There's a link to that in the description and in the right hand corner of the screen if you want to check it out. I've played the maps more since that video was recorded, got more familiar with them, and now it's time to rank each one from worst to best. There's no criteria for anything on the list, it's all purely based on my own opinion and which one I enjoyed the most. Coming in at the number 9 spot as the worst map in Call of Duty World War II, we have the Tortured Path. This is a map I heard a lot before jumping into my first game because whenever anyone in the community here on YouTube or on Reddit or Twitter posted a ranking or a tier list of all the maps in the franchise, the Tortured Path was always close to or at the bottom of the list. And after playing, I definitely understand why. First and foremost, this is not a round-based map like we're used to. It's also not an open world experience like Outbreak and Cold War, and it doesn't have any roguelike influence like Dork Fong. It's, well, I don't really know what it is, to be honest. I suppose the closest comparison would be Outbreak, except instead of having 3 open world maps that you explore, you have 3 small survival maps to explore. You survive in these 3 survival maps for about 10 rounds before fighting a boss, and then leaving to the next map, and after the 3rd map, the game just ends. The whole experience feels extremely disconnected, and that disconnected feeling starts before you even get into the map itself. For starters, the Tortured Path is in an entirely separate menu with a different ranking system entirely for some reason. I can't think of a good reason why this couldn't just be part of zombies, since this doesn't add anything substantial to the mode itself. There's also the opening cutscene that doesn't show you anything that's happening since the end of the last map, the Shadowed Throne. The cutscene starts by telling you that a zombie horde has taken over the European fronts, but they don't show you any of that aside from a few still pictures. The cutscene ends with our main characters in what looks like the Arctic, and then we hard cut to some random group of soldiers in a Spanish countryside. There's absolutely no transition. It's visual whiplash of the worst kind. Anyway, when you get into the map itself, it starts out pretty well for the most part. There's no power to turn on, so you can go right ahead and start unlocking Pack-a-Punch. You can get your perks, and they did a neat thing where instead of having a set wall buy, you have a wall buy that will give you a random weapon for a specific weapon class. So instead of going up to the wall and buying an MP40, you can get a random SMG or a random assault rifle or LMG depending on which wall buy you go to. It's a neat twist on something like the mystery box, and in this particular context, I think it works. Once you get to rounds 3, 6, and 9 respectively, you'll have to complete an objective to progress, something similar to Outbreak or Dork Fong. For the most part, I don't really like any of the objectives in the Tortured Path. Most of them are way too easy and oftentimes don't even shake up the gameplay too much. They're all the most basic, simple objectives possible. Defend this location, interact with these 3 things around the map before time runs out, defeat these special zombies, and so on. It's nothing you haven't seen 1,000 times in other games out there. I should also note that if you fail any of these objectives, the game ends instantly, so it can be extremely punishing if you don't already know what you're doing or are unprepared. And then at round 10, you're forced to fight a boss as your objective for the round. If you die, the game will obviously end, and if you win, you hold out in a small circle for a minute before the game just ends. The entire map is based on the hope that you'll find that 10-round loop fun, and for me, it just isn't. The fun of a horde mode is watching yourself get stronger and stronger over time, and you need more than 10 rounds to do that. It's also not exactly fulfilling to watch the progress you did make in those 10 rounds be completely erased the second you move on to the next map. Like, imagine playing Black Ops 2, but instead of going for round 30 on town, you got to round 10 on town, then quit the game and started playing farm, and then after getting to round 10 on farm, you started playing bus depot. You would never do that. That's not how people play zombies. It doesn't make any sense. The Tortured Path's reputation is also further sullied by its abysmal launch. Now, I only played this map for my myself this year, but after researching the maps further for this video, all of that intense negativity surrounding this map came back to me instantly. I remember this controversy like it was yesterday. So if you didn't know, the 3 survival maps that make up the Tortured Path are playable as survival maps, just like Town, Farm, and Bus Depot are on Transit in Black Ops 2. In fact, we're going to rank those survival maps in this video. However, when the DLC launched, these survival maps weren't initially available to everyone who bought the DLC. Instead, you had to unlock these survival maps by completing the Easter egg on the Tortured Path. Keep in mind that most Easter eggs in Zombies have a completion rate of less than 1%. It's not an aspect of the game people often interact with, despite what you see here on YouTube. And on top of that, you initially had to complete the Easter egg in a public match. It was not doable in custom games or in a solo match. You also had to complete the main Easter egg for the Tortured Path all in a row. So you had to complete the Easter egg for the first survival map, or Chapter 1 as they call it in the Tortured Path, and then for the second map, and then the third. If you completed the Chapter 1 Easter egg and then failed the Chapter 2 Easter egg after that, you had to go back and then recomplete Chapter 1 before attempting Chapter 2 again. It's like a gauntlet. As you might imagine, doing that in a public match, potentially with randoms depending on the size of your group, wasn't a recipe for success. Thankfully, Sledgehammer did eventually make the Easter eggs work in custom games and unlock the survival maps for everyone who bought the DLC, but the fact that this was even considered should be a permanent blemish on the game mode. As a whole, I simply don't know who the Tortured Path is even for. Even if you like zombies with objectives mixed in, Outbreak is such a better experience. You have an open world to explore, a handful of Easter eggs that the community has found far more enjoyable from what I can see, and most importantly, there's no hard round cap like there is on the Tortured Path. Hell, I would even consider the objective-based maps in Vanguard more enjoyable than the Tortured Path, because there's no round cap. The entire point of Zombies was to see how high of a round you could reach, so why on earth would you put a hard cap on that? The only reason you should ever buy this particular DLC is to play the 3 survival maps that are now available to anyone with DLC 3. The Tortured Path is in and of itself the worst Zombies experience to date, and I don't think there's anything redeemable about it. Moving into the number 8 spot, now that we're finally done with the Tortured Path, we have another map that I genuinely dislike, and that's the Shadowed Throne. Unlike the Tortured Path, the Shadowed Throne doesn't do a myriad of things that make it terrible. In fact, I actually have a few positive things to say about the map. For starters, the Shadowed Throne might have the best wonder weapon variety in the entire franchise to date. You have a number of melee weapons that function as wonder weapons, you have the map's main wonder weapon, the Wonderbus, and you have the Tesla gun returning from the Final Reich, and the Ripsaw returning from the Darkest Shore as well. There's a lot of power weapons on this map, and one of them will no doubt fit your playstyle. The Easter egg opens up a lot of different areas on the map, meaning you have a reason to at least attempt to progress through some of the Easter egg in every match. That being said, the standard layout is also pretty good, so you don't have to touch the Easter egg if you don't want to. However, you can take everything the map does right and throw it straight into the trash, because it destroys any goodwill by making Pack-a-Punch nearly impossible to obtain without a guide. Now, the actual guide to get Pack-a-Punch itself is actually pretty straightforward on the surface. All you have to do is charge some fuses on the wall by shooting them with your wonder weapon. If you have the Wonderbus wonder weapon, you can get this done in under a minute. The problem is getting the Wonderbus, because unlocking Pack-a-Punch requires you to start the main Easter egg, which is ludicrous. The first thing you need to do is get a Geist Bolt from a Sizzler zombie, which you can get to spawn by completing a fairly straightforward puzzle involving the radio in the main courtyard. That part is pretty simple if you're an observant player. Dialing in the frequency on the radio is a little fiddly, but apart from that, I have no complaints about this step. Once you do that, you need to find a box on the map that looks like any other box that the army would put ammo in, and when you shoot it, flares will fly into the air, a blimp will fly overhead, and eventually that will cause a Sizzler to spawn that you can then melee to get the part for the wonder weapon. It's a pretty simple quest if you know it's there, but if you don't look up a guide beforehand to learn that box even exists, the only way you're going to find this is if you accidentally happen to shoot it, which just isn't great design. But that isn't the only part of the Pack-a-Punch quest that needs a guide, since the second and equally infuriating part of this quest is finding a battery for the Wonderbus. The battery is just like any other randomized part that you can find around the map, like parts for the zombie shield in previous Treyarch made games. That is in and of itself not too bad. The problem is that there's no indicator for when you walk next to the battery, meaning unless you're walking around the map holding X or square or F or whatever your interact button is, you're never going to know this thing exists without looking up a guide. Once you have those two parts, you can then build the Wonder Bus to then find the fuses on the wall you need to charge, which you might also need a guide for since they're both hidden behind walls that need to be broken with an explosive to be visible to the player. If you've seen my tier list ranking zombies maps, you know how important things like Pack-a-Punch quests are to me. If you have a map where a key feature like Pack-a-Punch is so hidden that you're likely never going to find it without a guide, I'm automatically going to discount that map based on that and that alone, and I'll be justified in doing it. I did it with Transit and its poorly designed glitchy Pack-a-Punch quest. I did it with Dead of the Night and its 169,000 possible permutations to unlock Pack-a-Punch, and I'm doing it here with the Shadowed Throne. Unlike Dead of the Night, once you have a guide, it's easy to understand and memorize what you're supposed to do and execute it in game, and unlike Transit, there are no bugs or glitches that make the process frustratingly inconsistent, nor is there a wasteland that you have to slowly run through every time you attempt to unlock Pack-a-Punch, but what you do have is a quest that will likely force you to leave the game and access information that the game should have provided the player with. It's the failure of presentation, and it's one that sinks the entire map for myself and anyone who wants to play games casually without external help. And it's one that the game could have easily fixed. The Final Reich introduced something called the Notebook, which gave players information on how to access key features just like this one. Some hardcore fans complained and it was neutered in the Darkest Shore, the map just before the Shadow Throne. The game has a medium for this exact situation and it fails to use it, making this entire quest not just infuriating, but unnecessarily infuriating. Alright, we spent a lot of time on those last two maps, so let's blitz through all of the survival maps quickly. At the number 7 spot, we have the U.S.S. Mount Olympus. This is a survival map based off the second chapter of the Tortured Path. The reason I have this map as the worst of the 4 survival maps is because this map takes place on a ship, and the developers used that as an opportunity to have the map be tilted at all times. Yeah, the map is always tilted to either the left or right. Nothing is ever straight up or down like it should be. It's like you're playing the entire game through a Dutch angle, and it doesn't add anything to the game. The only change this makes, other than the visuals being askew, is that cars on the map will shift to the left or right depending on which way the ship is tilted. I guess no one could be bothered to pull the parking brake on those cars. Those cars will occasionally block your path, and if you're walking past them as the ship starts to tilt, the cars can kill you, which isn't very fun at all. I imagine it's pretty fun to watch in a co-op game, but it's not fun to be killed by them. It's not a bad map, all things considered, but it's definitely my least favorite of the bunch. And we'll get back to the survival maps that were part of the Tortured Path, but first we need to talk about Gröesten Haus. This is the survival map that you get for completing the Easter egg on the Final Reich. It's just a house from the prologue, but now you can play it as a traditional survival map. It's really claustrophobic and really reliant on randomness. The only way to get pack-a-punched weapons is from the mystery box, and all the perks are obtained through what is essentially a Wonder Fizz. I like the map for the most part, however, that Wonder Fizz is exactly why Gröesten Haus isn't any higher on my list. The Wonder Fizz in World War II differs from the Wonder Fizz in a game like Black Ops 2 or 3 in a pretty key way. Player choice. When you took a chance on the Wonder Fizz on a map like Origins, it would spit out a random perk, but you didn't have to take that random perk if you didn't want to. That isn't the case for World War II zombies. If the Wonder Fizz decides to give you, for example, stamina, you're going to get stamina whether you like it or not. Thankfully, you're not entirely locked into your perk choice in this game. If you attempt to buy a 5th perk, it will replace your 1st perk, but because the Wonder Fizz is random and the perk selection is forced on you, it's going to be a while before you get the combination of perks that you actually want. On top of that, for some reason, the Wonder Fizz in World War II has a cooldown, meaning you're going to have a potentially terrible perk combination well into the late game in this map. Also, the fact that it's locked behind an Easter egg completion isn't exactly ideal. Thankfully, you can access Gröesten Haus in local play, otherwise I simply wouldn't have bothered with it at all. And coming in at the number 5 spot, we have Bodega... Oh god, how do you pronounce this? I have to look up how to pronounce this. Bodega Cervantes. Bodega Cervantes. Bodega Cervantes. I'm sure that's terrible. That's what 2 entirely different pronunciation guys give me. And that's what I got. And coming in at the number 5 spot, we have Bodega Cervantes. This map is based off the first chapter of the Tortured Path, and as a survival map, it's pretty good. You got some wide open areas for a handful of people to train in. The map itself looks nice, and you got some additional challenge with the Brenner that spawns in every 10 rounds or so. It's a pretty simple survival map. Not too much I need to say about it. And then at the number 4 spot, we have the Altar of Blood. This is the survival map based on the third and final chapter of the Tortured Path. This one is just a little more enclosed than Bodega Cervantes, which makes it a bit more challenging in a way that works for me. You also have a trap in the center of the map that makes the map just a little more friendly for high rounds. I don't think Altar of Blood is a massive step up from Bodega Cervantes in the grand scheme of things. If I had to swap the two on my list, I wouldn't be the least bit upset. Alright. Back to the big maps. At the number 3 spot, we have the Darkest Shore. I know we just had a bunch of small survival maps between the Darkest Shore and the last mainline map, and I didn't have too many positive things to say about that mainline map. The Darkest Shore is also seen by many as one of the worst maps in the game, if not of all time, so let me just say right off the bat that I like the Darkest Shore. It's a pretty good map, but it definitely has some issues. We'll get into them. The best part about the Darkest Shore is its atmosphere. I love this map's take on horror. The launch map, the Final Reich, largely conveys its terror through gore and body mutilation. The scares come from the grotesqueness of those zombies, the industrial nature of their creation, and things like that. And that's all well and good, but the Darkest Shore pushes the horror into a more psychological direction. The most obvious example of this is the intense fog, the map's new boss, the... oh god, this is another thing I can't pronounce. Moishler? Moishlers. Moishla? Moishla. Moishla? They're necromorphs. They're necromorphs. They're necromorphs from Dead Space. The developers made Dead Space a long time ago. They're necromorphs. I'm gonna call them necromorphs because that's what they are. I mean, look at them. I'm putting 2 pictures of them on the screen. Look at them. They're necromorphs. They're necromorphs with long tongues. That's what they are. Anyway, the Moishlers are the most intelligent enemies in the entire franchise, bar none, and their stature as one of the most difficult in the game make you respect and fear them. These enemies are also a part of the new fog rounds. The fog on the Darkest Shore is the thickest fog in the entire franchise. You cannot see a thing in this fog, and the enemies also can't see you unless you attack them. This adds almost a stealth element, and it slows the game down to a survival horror-like pace. However, the Moishlers, the necromorphs, can still see you. This combination cranks up the tension as you're listening for regular zombies hoping you don't startle them, and you're also listening to hear a Moishler necromorph creep up behind you or see their necromorph-esque silhouette approach you from a distance. The atmosphere is excellent, but the map does more well than just the atmosphere. The minecarts around the map are one of the best transportation systems in the entire franchise. Getting from one side of the map to the other is quick, and you can easily call the carts to your location and decide exactly where they go from any of their 3 locations. Pack-a-Punch is also simple and easy to access, which definitely doesn't hurt. That being said, the Darkest Shore is not a perfect map. While I love the atmosphere, the 2 tentpole elements of that atmosphere do negatively impact the gameplay. The fog was controversial since its reveal trailers leading up to launch and still remains a sore subject to this day. While the intense fog adds a survival horror-like pacing to the game, Zombies has never been and will never be a horror game. Not everyone liked that slow pacing, much less the complete lack of visibility that came with it. And if that didn't already make the fog unpopular, then the sense of dread that the Moishlers provided would certainly seal the deal. While I do have a lot of praise for the Moishlers on paper, in practice they're a little more than frustrating. What they add to the atmosphere is excellent, but their behavior and stats make them a challenging enemy in more ways than one. The Moishlers will actively intend to flank you and run away when they take too much damage. They can withstand what feels like the same amount of firepower as a Brenner, and they can deal a significant amount of damage really quickly too. On top of that, multiple can spawn at once, even in solo. They're basically tanks that can match your speed and potentially even outsmart you, which is a disastrous combination. Dealing with them and a horde of regular zombies and the numerous special enemies the game throws at you is a real challenge, and not one that jives with what many people expect out of zombies. The Darkest Shore is a double-edged sword, and one that a large portion of the community found cutting the themselves more often than not. If you don't have the map's wonder weapon, dealing with these negative aspects is often more trouble than it's worth. A lot of people really love the Final Reich when World War II launched, and it still has a following to this day. It's a strong map in just about every facet, so I can completely understand why the Darkest Shore was seen as a disappointment when DLC 1 finally rolled around. That being said, while I understand it's not a map for everyone, I can't say it's as bad as some people make it out to be. Moving on to the number 2 spot as the second best map in World War II Zombies, we have the Frozen Dawn. This is my second favorite map in the entire game, but unfortunately when it comes to the mainline maps, it's the map I have the least to say about. The visuals of the map are excellent and stand out among the rest of the game's lineup. I also love that there aren't any guardrails on the edges of the map. You can fall off the edge of the map if you aren't paying attention, and as someone who enjoys die rise for that very reason, I like that it returned here in a small way. The big reason to play the Frozen Dawn is the wonder weapons. It goes for the origin style of 4 unique wonder weapons, 1 for each player, and the Frozen Dawn's take on it is actually really good. Unlike previous maps, the balance between the 4 wonder weapons is really even. There's no ice staff or lightning bow that stands head and shoulders above the other 3. All 4 are more or less on the same footing, and which one you pick ultimately comes down to your playstyle or which upgrade quests you prefer. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot going on outside of the wonder weapons though. If we continue the Origins comparison, Origins had the elemental staves, but you also have the G-Strike, the 1-inch punch, the Maxis drone and zombie shield, the golden shovel and helmet, and so on. On the Frozen Dawn, you have the wonder weapons and really nothing else. Thankfully, you could pack a punch just about any weapon and have a decent enough time training in the spawner room without any wonder weapons at all, but obviously it would have been nice to have a little more going on, and the same could honestly be said for the Darkest Shore as well. That being said, I'd be pretty comfortable swapping these two on my list if I had to. I'm only putting the Frozen Dawn ahead of the Darkest Shore because there's no double-edged sword quality to the Frozen Dawn. Your mileage may vary. And at the number 1 spot, to nobody's surprise, we have the Final Reich. The launch map for World War II Zombies is far and away its best. This is one of those rare maps that does almost everything right and almost nothing wrong. It's got a solid layout, though there are a few areas that feel a bit barren, and it's easy to get from one place to another fairly quickly. Unlocking Pack-a-Punch is simple and intuitive, by Zombies standards, and the power switches are easy to find with a combination of context clues and the notebook. The entire map has a narrative quality to it which I really enjoy. Even when you don't touch the Easter egg, that narrative quality definitely shines through. Speaking of Easter eggs, there are 2 in this map, a casual and hardcore Easter egg. This gives hardcore fans multiple options to take when attempting an Easter egg, and helps players who are new to quest lines and zombies get their foot in the door. The atmosphere is grounded in reality, which is something a lot of people wanted when this map came out. The Tesla gun is both a great wonder weapon, and getting its upgrades are fairly simple by Zombies standards. It's similar to something like the Dreisendrache Drak bows, except this time the Wrath of the Ancients equivalent doesn't suck, and it functions basically identically to a Wonder Waff. I apologize that this section is going to be short because I just don't have a whole lot of negative things to say about this map. One thing I find very annoying is the abundance of jump scare zombies. I get the developers were going for a horror theme with this game, but jump scares don't make the map any scarier. In fact, I haven't been frightened by them once. A lot of Easter egg guys find the Zeppelin boss fight annoying, and looking at the fight, I can definitely see why this might be frustrating, but as someone who doesn't do Easter eggs, I can't comment one way or the other. Let me know how it is in the comments below. And that's how I would rank every map in Call of Duty World War II Zombies. As a whole, while the game started out strong with the Final Reich, things fell off pretty quickly with the DLC. If you're thinking about picking up World War II for Zombies, I would recommend looking for a deal on the base game before buying any of the DLC. The Final Reich is head and shoulders above every other map in the entire game, so if you don't like the on-disc offering, you're probably going to hate everything in the DLC. I would squeeze everything out of the Final Reich and maybe even unlock Gröesten Haus while you're at it before even considering which DLC to buy. The Frozen Dawn is a good option if you like maps like Origins, though it doesn't live up to the hype that Origins and similar maps often receive. The Darkest Shore is something to consider if you really enjoyed the horror influences the mode has. Just know that it may backfire on you. The Shadow Throne isn't a terrible option if you're comfortable researching maps online to figure things out, and I would even argue that DLC 3 has some worthwhile content. While I wouldn't recommend the Tortured Path to anyone, even those who really like Outbreak, having an additional 3 3 survival maps isn't a bad deal, all things considered. There is value within the DLC maps, but I have a hard time recommending the entire package to most people. If you were starting with a franchise from scratch, this is the last game I would recommend playing, but it is still one that I would recommend playing at some point, even all the DLC. Most of the DLC. If you can get the base game for cheap, then I would absolutely go for it. The Final Reich is awesome, and while you're unlikely to find any quality multiplayer matches nowadays, the campaign can keep you engaged for an additional few hours at least. The only concern I would have beyond getting the game for as little money as possible is finding the space for it on your hard drive. From there, I would pick and choose the DLCs carefully as you go, or wait for a sale on the season pass. But those are just my thoughts. Of course, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, like the video if you made it this far, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.